The courtroom smelled of old wood and broken promises. Elijah Grant sat at the defendant's table, his calloused hands folded on the polished mahogany surface, watching dust particles drift through the afternoon light that slanted through the tall windows. Across the aisle, Victoria, his wife of 12 years, sat with her attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Camden who wore confidence like expensive cologne. She wouldn't look at Elijah. Not once. Not since they'd entered this room 3 hours ago. Judge Margaret Holloway presided from her bench, silver-haired and stern, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose as she reviewed document after document. The gallery behind them was nearly empty, just Victoria's sister Renee, Elijah's childhood friend Marcus, and a court reporter whose fingers danced across her stenotype with mechanical precision. "Mr. Camden," Judge Holloway said, her voice cutting through the silence, "you're claiming your client is entitled to half of Mr. Grant's assets, including his business, Grant Restoration Services. That's a company valued at approximately $8 million. Correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Camden replied smoothly, standing with practiced ease. Mrs. Grant supported her husband throughout the building of this enterprise. She managed the household, entertained clients, and provided the emotional foundation that allowed Mr. Grant to focus entirely on his work. Under California community property law, she's entitled to her fair share. Elijah felt his jaw tighten. Fair share. The words tasted bitter in his mind. Victoria had been absent more than present during those building years. The late nights when he'd worked until his hands bled. The weekends spent learning about historic architecture. The months when he'd eaten ramen so he could afford better tools for restoration projects. His attorney, Patricia Chun, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a reputation for thoroughness, leaned toward him. "Not yet," she whispered. "Let him finish." Camden continued, pacing slightly as he addressed the judge. "Furthermore, Your Honor, Mrs. Grant endured significant emotional distress during this marriage. Mr. Grant's obsession with his work created an environment of neglect. She deserves not only her share of assets but also alimony to maintain the lifestyle to which she's become accustomed." Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though Elijah noticed no actual tears. She'd always been good at performances. It was one of the things he'd loved about her once. Her ability to light up a room, to make people believe whatever story she wanted to tell. He just never thought he'd be on the receiving end of one of her fictions. Judge Holloway removed her glasses. "Ms. Chun, your response?" Patricia stood slowly, deliberately. She had a manila folder in her hands, unmarked and thin. "Your Honor, my client doesn't dispute that Mrs. Grant deserves fair treatment under the law. However, the picture Mr. Camden has painted is incomplete. Before we discuss asset division, there's a matter of fundamental dishonesty that this court needs to address." Camden's eyebrow arched. "Objection, Your Honor. Ms. Chun is being unnecessarily dramatic." "I'll allow it," Judge Holloway interrupted. "Continue, Ms. Chun." Patricia walked to the center of the room, holding the folder like it contained something fragile and dangerous. "Your Honor, Elijah Grant built his restoration business from nothing. He started 12 years ago with a single project, restoring a Victorian home in Pasadena that had been condemned. He worked 16-hour days. He taught himself historic carpentry techniques. He turned that one project into a company that now employs 43 people and has restored some of the most significant historic buildings in Southern California." "We're not disputing his work ethic," Camden interjected. "We're simply saying that behind every successful man is a woman who had nothing to do with his success," Patricia finished, her voice sharp as glass. "In fact, Your Honor, Mrs. Grant actively worked against her husband's business." Victoria's head snapped up for the first time. Color rose in her pale cheeks. Judge Holloway leaned forward. "That's quite an accusation, Ms. Chun. I hope you have evidence." "I do, Your Honor." Patricia opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper. "This is a legally executed prenuptial agreement, signed by both parties 3 days before their wedding 12 years ago." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Elijah watched Victoria's face drain of color, watched her lean urgently toward Camden and whisper something frantic. Camden's confident expression flickered, just for a moment. "Your Honor," Camden said quickly, "we were never provided with any prenuptial agreement during discovery, because your client claimed it didn't exist," Patricia said coolly. Mrs. Grant stated, under oath during her deposition, that no such agreement was ever signed. She claimed that Mr. Grant had proposed a prenup, but that she'd refused and he'd ultimately agreed to marry without one. Judge Holloway extended her hand. "I'll see that document." Patricia handed the prenup to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Holloway. As the judge read, Elijah's mind drifted back to the beginning, to when Victoria had been everything he thought he wanted. They'd met at an art gallery opening in downtown Los Angeles. Elijah had been there reluctantly, dragged along by Marcus, who insisted he needed to meet people and stop living like a hermit in his workshop. Victoria had been standing in front of a painting of a deconstructed house, wearing a red dress that seemed to glow in the gallery lights. She turned to him and said, "It's ugly, isn't it? All those broken pieces pretending to be art." He'd laughed. "I work with broken pieces. Sometimes they're the most beautiful parts." She'd been fascinated by his work, or so he'd thought. In those early months, she'd visit his workshop, watch him restore antique window frames and hand-carved moldings. She'd run her fingers along the smooth wood and tell him he was an artist. He'd believed her. He'd believed in them. But after the wedding, things changed. The workshop visits stopped. Victoria wanted him home by 6, wanted him at charity events and dinner parties with people he didn't know and didn't particularly like. She complained about the sawdust on his clothes, the way his hands were always rough with work. She wanted him to hire people to do the actual restoration so he could focus on being a businessman. "You can't scale intimacy," he'd told her once. "Every building tells a story. I need to be the one listening." "You listen to buildings better than you listen to me," she replied. Maybe that had been true. Buildings didn't change their minds. They didn't promise to support your dreams and then resent you for chasing them. Judge Holloway's voice pulled him back to the present. "This prenuptial agreement appears valid. It's properly witnessed, notarized, and clearly states that in the event of divorce, each party retains their separate property, including any business ventures started before or during the marriage. It also specifies that Mrs. Grant would receive a one-time settlement of $200,000 if the marriage ended, regardless of the business's value." Victoria stood abruptly. "That's not... I never..." Camden grabbed her arm, pulling her back down. "Your Honor," Camden said, his smooth confidence cracking slightly, "I'd like to request a recess to consult with my client." "Denied," Judge Holloway said firmly. "Ms. Chun, do you have an explanation for why this document wasn't produced earlier?" "Yes, Your Honor. Because Mrs. Grant stole the original from my client's home office 18 months ago, shortly before she filed for divorce. Mr. Grant had kept it in a safe. When he discovered it missing, he assumed it had been misplaced during a move. It wasn't until we subpoenaed his attorney who drafted the original agreement that we learned the drafting attorney had kept a digital copy in his secure files. We've also brought that attorney here today to authenticate the document. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel." Marcus, sitting in the gallery, allowed himself a small smile. He'd been the one who remembered Elijah mentioning the old lawyer, a semi-retired attorney named Bernard Kowalski, who'd done the prenup as a favor because his daughter had hired Elijah to restore her historic home. Judge Holloway studied Victoria with new intensity. "Mrs. Grant, did you remove this document from your husband's possession?" Victoria's lawyer whispered urgently to her. She shook her head, but her face was pale as paper, and her hands trembled in her lap. "Your Honor," Camden tried again, "even if this prenup exists, there's a question of whether it should be enforced. Prenuptial agreements can be challenged if they're shown to be unconscionable. $200,000 is hardly unconscionable," Judge Holloway interrupted, "particularly when Mrs. Grant signed it of her own free will, with her own attorney present. That's noted right here in the document." Elijah remembered that day vividly. Victoria's attorney had been her father's friend, a jovial man who'd assured them both that this was just a formality, that they'd never need it because their love was real. Elijah had wanted the prenup not because he doubted Victoria, but because he'd learned from his own father's divorce that good people could become strangers when money was involved. He'd wanted to protect what he built, yes, but also to protect their love from ever being reduced to a transaction. The irony wasn't lost on him now. "Your Honor," Patricia continued, sensing her advantage. "There's more to this story. The prenup isn't the only document Mrs. Grant has lied about." "May I call Mr. Elijah Grant to testify?" Judge Holloway nodded. "Proceed." Elijah stood, his 6-foot frame unfolding from the chair. He moved to the witness stand, was sworn in, and sat down. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands were steady. Years of precise restoration work had taught him the value of calm under pressure. Patricia approached him gently. "Mr. Grant, can you tell the court about your business? Grant Restoration Services?" Elijah cleared his throat. "I specialize in historic building restoration. I work on structures that are usually over 100 years old: Victorian homes, craftsman bungalows, old theaters, historic hotels. The work requires understanding original construction techniques, sourcing period-appropriate materials, and respecting the building's history while making it safe and functional for modern use." "And how did you build this business?" "From the ground up. I took out a $50,000 loan against my truck and tools to buy my first property, a condemned Victorian that everyone said should be demolished. I spent 8 months restoring it myself. When I sold it, I made enough to buy 2 more properties. I worked 7 days a week, sometimes sleeping on site. I learned by doing, by making mistakes and fixing them, by reading every book I could find on historic architecture." "Was your wife involved in this work?" Elijah paused, choosing his words carefully. "At first, she seemed interested, but once we married, she wanted me to change directions. She thought I should flip houses, buy cheap, renovate quickly, sell fast. That's not what I do. I preserve history. That took time she wasn't willing to give." Camden stood. "Objection. This is just my client's husband complaining about marital differences." "I'll allow it," Judge Holloway said. "Continue, Mr. Grant." "Victoria wanted a different lifestyle than my business could provide in the early years. She wanted a big house in the right neighborhood, expensive cars, country club memberships. I told her we needed to reinvest in the business to build something sustainable. We argued about it constantly. Eventually, she started her own venture, an interior design business. I supported that. I even referred clients to her." "Did her business succeed?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "She shut it down after 2 years. Said it was too much work for too little return. After that, she seemed to resent that my business was growing while hers had failed. She began criticizing everything I did. My choice of projects, my employees, my refusal to cut corners." Patricia walked to her table and picked up another document. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a series of emails between Mrs. Grant and several of Mr. Grant's clients, sent over the past 3 years. Victoria went rigid. Camden looked confused. This was clearly something he hadn't known about. Judge Holloway accepted the documents. As she read, her expression grew increasingly stern. "These emails, Mrs. Grant, did you contact your husband's clients to disparage his work?" The courtroom was silent. Patricia spoke into that silence. "Those emails show Mrs. Grant telling clients that her husband was overcharging them, that his attention to historical accuracy was obsessive and wasteful, and that they could get the same work done cheaper elsewhere. In 3 instances, clients canceled contracts based on these emails. Mr. Grant lost over $400,000 in business." Elijah watched Victoria, waiting for her to deny it, to explain it away, but she just sat there, frozen. Marcus, in the gallery, shook his head in disgust. He'd warned Elijah years ago that Victoria was poisoned. "She's always looking at what you could be instead of seeing who you are," Marcus had said. Elijah hadn't listened. He'd thought love could bridge any gap. Judge Holloway removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Mrs. Grant, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you send these emails?" Camden whispered urgently to his client. Finally, Victoria spoke, her voice small. "I was trying to help. Elijah was working too hard, charging too little. I thought if he had fewer projects, he'd have more time. For you, Elijah said quietly from the witness stand. You wanted me to have more time for you, even if it meant destroying what I'd built. I wanted my husband. Victoria's composure shattered. I wanted someone who came home at a reasonable hour, who cared about our life together, who didn't choose old buildings over me. I never chose buildings over you, Elijah said, his voice carrying the weight of 12 years of frustration. I chose my calling. I chose work that mattered to me. You chose to resent me for it instead of building your own life. Judge Holloway rapped her gavel. That's enough. Mr. Grant, you may step down. As Elijah returned to his seat, Patricia presented one final document. Your Honor, this is a bank statement from an account Mrs. Grant opened secretly 3 years ago. She's been transferring money from their joint household account, money Mr. Grant provided for household expenses, into this private account. The total amount transferred is approximately $300,000. Camden's face went ashen. He clearly hadn't known about this either. Victoria had lied to her own attorney. Your Honor, Camden said weakly, I request a recess. Request denied. Judge Holloway's voice was ice. I've heard enough. Judge Holloway gathered the documents before her, her expression unreadable. The late afternoon light had deepened to amber, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. Elijah could hear his own heartbeat in the silence, could feel Marcus's supportive presence behind him like an anchor. I've presided over hundreds of divorce cases, Judge Holloway began, and I've seen people at their worst. Lying, manipulating, using children as weapons. But this case is particularly troubling because it involves not just the dissolution of a marriage, but a deliberate campaign to destroy a man's livelihood. Victoria's attorney tried once more. Your Honor, if I could just have a moment to confer with my client. Mr. Camden, your client lied to you. She lied under oath during her deposition. She stole documents, sabotaged her husband's business, and embezzled marital funds. The only question now is what consequences she'll face. Victoria began to cry, real tears this time. Renee, her sister, stood up in the gallery as if to go to her, then seemed to think better of it and sat back down. The prenuptial agreement is valid and enforceable, Judge Holloway declared. Mrs. Grant will receive the $200,000 specified in that agreement, minus the $300,000 she illegally transferred to her private account. Since she's already taken more than she was entitled to, she will receive nothing. Furthermore, she will return the $100,000 difference to Mr. Grant within 30 days. Your Honor, Camden began. I'm not finished. Mrs. Grant will also be responsible for her own legal fees and will pay 50% of Mr. Grant's legal fees as a sanction for her fraudulent conduct. I'm also referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for possible criminal charges related to theft and perjury. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. She slumped in her chair, all pretense of victimhood gone. Patricia stood. Your Honor, my client would like to make a brief statement. Judge Holloway nodded. Mr. Grant. Elijah stood, his legs steadier than he expected. He looked at Victoria for the first time in hours. Really looked at her. The woman he'd loved. The woman he'd thought would be his partner through life. I don't hate you, he said quietly. I'm sad for what we could have been. But you made choices, Victoria. You chose to see my passion as competition instead of celebrating it with me. You chose to tear down instead of build up. I hope someday you find something you love as much as I love restoration work. Something that makes you understand why I couldn't give it up, even for you. Victoria's tears flowed freely now, but she said nothing. Judge Holloway rapped her gavel. This court finds the prenuptial agreement valid and enforceable. The marriage between Elijah Grant and Victoria Grant is hereby dissolved. We're adjourned. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a final punctuation mark on 12 years of his life. Outside the courthouse, the California sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Elijah of old stained glass. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm and grounding. You did it, brother, Marcus said. You stood up for yourself. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Patricia Chun joined them on the courthouse steps, her briefcase in hand. Mr. Grant, I know today was difficult, but you should feel proud. You protected your life's work. Elijah nodded, but he felt numb more than proud. Thank you, Patricia, for everything. For believing me when I said there was a prenup. For tracking down Bernard. Bernard Kowalski sends his regards, by the way. He's proud of you too. Said that Victorian home you restored for his daughter is still the most beautiful house on the block. That brought a genuine smile to Elijah's face. It was a good project. They all are. As Patricia left, Marcus suggested dinner, but Elijah declined. He needed to be alone, or rather, he needed to be with the only thing that had never betrayed him. His work. He drove to his current project, a 1920s movie theater in downtown Los Angeles that had been slated for demolition before a preservation group hired him to save it. The building stood empty in the gathering dusk, its Art Deco facade showing the careful restoration work his team had already completed. Elijah unlocked the side door and stepped inside. The theater smelled of fresh plaster and old wood, of history being preserved. He walked down the aisle between rows of seats that would soon be reupholstered in period-appropriate fabric. His footsteps echoed in the vast space. Above him, the ornate ceiling, covered in hand-painted clouds and stars, glowed softly in the last light of day filtering through the windows. This was where he belonged. Not in a courtroom defending his right to exist as himself, but here, in these spaces that whispered stories of the past and begged to be heard in the future. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. You good? Elijah typed back. Yeah, I'm good. Better than I've been in years. And it was true. The weight he'd been carrying, the constant arguments, the guilt over not being the husband Victoria wanted, the fear of losing everything he'd built. It was gone. Not completely, not overnight, but the heaviest stones had been lifted from his shoulders. Over the next weeks, word spread through the restoration and architecture community about the court case. Several clients who'd canceled contracts reached out to apologize and rehire him. Others, who'd heard about his integrity and his passion, contacted him about new projects. 3 months later, Elijah stood in the restored theater on opening night. The building was packed with people dressed in vintage 1920s attire, celebrating the return of a piece of Los Angeles history. The ornate light fixtures he'd painstakingly restored cast warm light over the crowd. The original organ, which his team had spent 6 weeks bringing back to life, filled the space with music. Marcus found him by the concession stand. This is incredible, man. You saved a piece of history. We saved it, Elijah corrected. My whole team. This isn't just my work. It's all of ours. Still, you're the one who saw what it could be. Victoria never understood that. Elijah shook his head. Victoria wanted me to be something I'm not. That's not a crime, it's just incompatibility. We both deserve partners who celebrate us, not change us. As the night went on, Elijah watched people explore the theater, saw their faces light up as they discovered details his team had restored. The hand-carved moldings, the original tile work, the brass fixtures. Each delighted expression reminded him why he did this work, why it mattered. Late that night, after everyone had gone, Elijah stood alone on the theater stage, looking out at the empty seats. His phone rang. An unknown number. Elijah Grant, he answered. Mr. Grant, this is Sarah Chun from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I'm calling about a project we think you'd be perfect for. How would you feel about restoring a Frank Lloyd Wright property? Elijah smiled in the darkness of the empty theater. Tell me more. As Sarah described the project, a prairie school masterpiece that had fallen into disrepair, Elijah felt the familiar spark of excitement, the pull of a new challenge. This was his life now. Not fighting in courtrooms or defending his choices, but doing what he'd always done. Taking broken, forgotten things and helping them shine again. Sometimes, he thought, the greatest victory isn't winning a battle. It's refusing to let anyone take away who you are. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Elijah received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a check for $100,000, the amount Victoria had been ordered to repay. There was no note, no explanation, just the money, and with it, the final severing of their connection. He donated half of it to a non-profit that taught historic preservation skills to at-risk youth. The other half he invested back into his business, creating a scholarship program for young people interested in learning traditional craftsmanship. Victoria, he heard through mutual acquaintances, had moved to San Francisco and started working for a tech company in their real estate division. He hoped she'd found something that fulfilled her. He genuinely did. As for Elijah, he stood in the workshop he'd built behind his modest house. The same workshop Victoria had once complained about, running his hands over a piece of century-old oak that would become part of a staircase railing in a Victorian mansion. The wood was scarred and weathered, but beneath the damage, the grain was beautiful. Everything could be restored, he thought, not to what it was, but to what it could be. And that, he'd learned, was enough.